Hi friends, my name is Cindy and I am one of the children's librarians at Portland Public Library in Portland, Maine. And this week for our read-along, we're going to read The Adventures of Sophie Mouse, A New Friend by Poppy Green and illustrated by Jennifer Bell. It's a really cute story. Look at that. All right. Chapter 1, Spring has sprung. Buzz, buzz, buzz. Outside the mouse family's cottage, a bumblebee zipped from flower to flower. Sitting at her easel in the sunshine, Sophie Mouse put down her paintbrush. Her eyes followed the bee. Oh, to be able to fly, she thought. I could see every inch of Silver Lake Forest. Maybe even to the other side of Forget-Me-Not Lake. I wonder how fast a bee flies when he really gets going. What would it be like to fly to the schoolhouse for the first day of school tomorrow? There she is daydreaming. What would Sophie? Sophie, her father's voice called out, snapping her out of her daydream. He was in the doorway of her cottage, which was nestled in between the roots of an oak tree. Are you done with your chores? George Mouse asked. When you are, you can go see Mom at the bakery. She's making nutmeg popovers today. Sophie's little nose twitched. She was sure she could already smell the sweet scent. Nutmeg popovers were one of her mother's specialties. At her bakery in Pine Needle Grove, Lily Mouse surely would have started making the batter at dawn before Sophie was even awake. Sophie hated to stop painting. It was the first spring day, warm enough to paint outside, but she had a little sweeping to do if she wanted to go to the bakery. Sophie hurried inside and found the willow twig broom. She had already swept the 3 small bedrooms upstairs. Just the main floor was left, under the toadstool table and birch branch stools, and around the spun silk couch. There she is, sweeping away. Sophie swept all the corners of the kitchen. Then she swept the pile of leaf bits and dust right out the door. Dad, I'm finished, she called. I'm going to Hattie's house on the way to the bakery. Hattie Frog was Sophie's best friend. Just then, way back in the rear of the cottage, a mouse's head popped up through a hole in the floor. It was Sophie's little brother, Winston. He was cleaning up the root cellar. I want to come too, Winston called. Sophie sighed. Winston was 6. She had been stuck inside the cottage with him for most of the winter vacation. Now that the weather was warming up, he wanted to tag along with Sophie everywhere. Have you finished your chores? Mr. Mouse asked Sophie's brother. There was a long silence. When Winston answered, his voice was quiet. Not yet. Well, finish up then, Mr. Mouse replied. You and I can go later. Sophie leaned her broom against the wall by the front door. Then she was off with an extra spring in her step. It wasn't that Sophie didn't like her brother. They had fun playing together, but Sophie was 2 years older, and it was the very last day of vacation. She wanted to fill it with 8-year-old adventures. Halfway to the stream, Sophie heard a rustle in the tall reeds to her right. She stopped in her tracks. Hello? Is someone there? Sophie called out. Here she is, stopping in her tracks in the reeds. She perked up her ears, listening carefully. But all was silent and still. Sophie's eyes scanned the reeds. She thought she could just make out a shadowy shape among them. Ooh, you want to see? I didn't notice that at first. Look at that, right there. She squinted and took a step closer. Now Sophie was sure someone was in there. But who was it? Chapter 2, A Perfect Day. Harriet Frog, Sophie called, using Hattie's full name. Is that you in there? There was no answer from the reeds, so Sophie called again. It's me, Sophie. There was a rustle. The reeds parted slowly. A green eye peeked out, and then Hattie hopped out into the open. Phew, it is you, Sophie said. I heard footsteps coming and, well, I'm glad it's you. Hattie was shy around strangers, but not with Sophie. They had known each other for as long as they could remember. Sophie told Hattie about the popovers. Want to come to the bakery? Sophie asked. We could stop at the lake on the way. Hattie giggled and shook her head. Sophie, Forget-Me-Not Lake isn't exactly on the way. Hattie is always so practical, thought Sophie, but she was right. The lake was a bit of a hike. Well, said Sophie, we have lots of time, and it's our last day of vacation. Hattie smiled. I'll tell my mom, she cried, then hopped off toward home. Sophie followed and waited outside Hattie's house. It was built on the bank of the stream, not far from Sophie's. Half the house sat floating on lily pads right on the water. The other half was built into the pebbly bank. Sophie knew that her dad, the town architect, had helped Mr. and Mrs. Frog design it. Soon Hattie was back, and she and Sophie were running off toward the lake. Please be home before dark, Mrs. Frog called after them. The girls never got into too much trouble in Silver Lake Forest. Now and then, Sophie came home with prickers on her tail or muddy clothing. One time she got lost exploring a mole tunnel, but she just asked one of the moles for directions and soon found her way home. The path to Forget-Me-Not Lake was long and winding and lined with berry bushes. Oh, these make the best purple paint, Sophie exclaimed, pointing to some ripe berries. She stopped to gather some. Sophie carried pouches in her pockets at all times for exactly this reason. Both the pouches and Sophie's pockets were always stained with berry juice. Finally, the girls arrived at Forget-Me-Not Lake. The water glittered in the morning sun. Sophie looked at Hattie. Are you thinking what I'm thinking? She asked. Well, Hattie said with a smile, you do have one wild imagination, Sophie Mouse. But if you're thinking we should go lily pad hopping, hop on. Sophie climbed onto Hattie's back and held on tight. Hattie leaped out onto the lake. She jumped from lily pad to lily pad, hopscotching across the water. This was their favorite thing to do at the lake. Later, the girls made flower crowns. They looked for four-leaf clovers. As usual, they didn't find any. They skipped stones on the water, counting the jumps. They played hide and seek. Then Sophie made stilts from sticks and tried to walk on them. There she is. When their tummies grumbled, it was time for popovers. The bell on the bakery door jingled as they entered. Mrs. Mouse was at the counter. Several animals were waiting patiently in line. Sophie and Hattie scurried behind the counter, just as they always did. Lily Mouse took a moment to hug them. Then she whispered, "A fresh batch of popovers just came out. Help yourselves." The girls smiled gleefully and hurried back into the kitchen. As they nibbled their popovers, Sophie sighed happily. It was turning out to be a great last day of vacation. Already she was thinking about the picture she would paint about it. She'd be sure to use her new purple berry juice. Chapter 3, School Surprises. The next morning, dressed in her best jumper dress and leggings, Sophie hurried to get her backpack ready. She was eager to see her friends she hadn't seen all winter. Plus, she thought, you never know exactly what will happen on the first day of school. Sophie zipped up her backpack. "Bye, Dad," Sophie called as she hurried out the door. "Wait for me," Winston cried. He ran after her, his shoelaces still untied. Sophie had almost forgotten. Winston was starting school this year. Mrs. Wise's one-room school, Silver Lake Elementary, was for all students ages 6 to 10. Sophie bent down to tie Winston's shoes. "Mrs. Wise will want you to learn to tie these yourself," she said firmly. Then, in a gentler voice, she added, "Come on, I'll show you the fun way to school." Instead of taking the path into Pine Needle Grove, past the bakery, the library, and the post office, Sophie led Winston to a little-known trail. It cut behind the library and ran through a tunnel of honeysuckle branches. The flower buds were just opening. Sophie could hear Winston behind her, taking deep breaths of the scent. The trail came out in the schoolyard. Sophie led Winston up to the front door and inside the Pine Bow schoolhouse. "Sophie!" Hattie's voice rang out. Sophie turned and waved. Hattie was standing with her big sister Liddy and their friend Ellie the squirrel. Just then, Piper the hummingbird and Zoe the bluebird flew in through the windows. Willie the toad was already sitting at a desk next to Malcolm the mole, and Ben the rabbit and his little brother James entered the room behind Sophie and Winston. Winston knew James from preschool, so they went off to find 2 desks together, a mouse-sized one for Winston and a bigger one for James. Sophie headed over to say hello to Hattie, Liddy, and Ellie, but just then Mrs. Wise, a neatly dressed owl with glasses, stood up at the front of the room. "Class," she said, "please take your seats." Sophie hurried to get a maple bark desk by a window so she could see outside. She loved looking out the window, even if Mrs. Wise did catch her daydreaming sometimes. "Welcome back to school," said Mrs. Wise when the students were seated. "I'm happy to see you all bright-eyed and ready to start another season. Now, I think we're all here." Mrs. Wise counted the students. "Oh, we're missing our new student. His family has just moved to Pine Needle Grove. His name is Owen. I know you will all make him feel very welcome." There's the teacher. At that moment, the door creaked open. "Here he is now," said Mrs. Wise. "Welcome, Owen." All the students turned in their seats and gasped. Ellie and Malcolm both let out little squeaks. Ben's ears stood straight up. Sophie rubbed her eyes to make sure she was seeing this right. Owen was a snake? And the next time that I read part 2, we will read all about Owen the snake and see. So stick around, come back, and thanks for listening, friends. My name is Cindy, and I'm one of the children's librarians in the Portland Public Library in Portland, Maine. Thanks for coming by. Bye-bye.